Hello, everyone. My name is Raul Melendez, and this is MPA545 Conflict Resolution and Labor Negotiation. In this presentation, I will identify a specific public employee union, SEIU Local 721, and explain the regions they serve and who they represent. I will define collective bargaining within California's statutory framework and explain the role of the Myers-Milius-Brown Act and the Public Employment Relations Board. I will then discuss in detail how the Supreme Court's decision in Janus versus AFS CME affected public sector unions. Additionally, I will analyze one recent peer-reviewed academic article and one news story on Wisconsin's Act 10 before concluding with how these relate to this week's material. The public employee union I selected is SEIU Local 721. They represent more than 95,000 public employees, and it is the largest public sector union in Southern California. The union represents workers in LA County, Riverside County, Ventura County, Orange County, among other counties in the region. Its members consist of healthcare workers, behavioral health workers, and other essential public worker services. For these local government employees, collective bargaining is governed primarily by the Myers-Milius-Brown Act, or MMBA. Collective bargaining and California's framework. Collective bargaining is the formal negotiation process between a union and a public employer over wages, hours, and working conditions. Through this process, unions advocate for employee pay, benefits, job protections, grievance procedures, and representation rights, resulting in legally binding agreements such as memorandums of understanding. Rather than adopting one comprehensive statute for a public employee, California developed separate laws for different groups. Local employees are governed by Myers-Milius-Brown Act, state employees by Dills Act, and public school employees by Educational Employment Relations Act. According to our course textbook, Chapter 6, authors Najita and Stern, 2001, collective bargaining in the public sector, this structure reflects a piecemeal statutory framework rather than a unified system. One key component of the framework in the Myers-Milius-Brown Act requires public employers and unions to meet and confer in good faith. To ensure that these obligations are followed, enforcement is centralized under Public Employment Relations Board, which oversees labor dispute and ensures compliance with public sector labor laws. This centralized enforcement contributes to bargaining stability in California. Janus versus American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employee, AFS-CME. In 2018, the Supreme Court decided Janus versus AFS-CME that the court ruled that mandatory agency fees for public employees violated the First Amendment because public sector's collective bargaining involved political speech. As a result, public employees can no longer be required to pay union dues unless they voluntarily opt in. For SEIU Local 721, this changed the union's funding structure. Before Janus non-members were required to pay agency fees to support collective bargainings. After the Janus case, all dues became voluntary, creating the potential for revenue loss and decreased memberships. However, while the funding model changed, the union's legal right to collectively bargain in California did not change because California maintained a strong statutory framework under the MMBA and the centralized enforcement through PERB. SEIU Local 721 continued negotiating contracts and representing employees. In response to Janus, unions shifted towards stronger member engagement and organizing strategies to retain voluntary members. Therefore, what changed was the financial and organizational model. However, the union's bargaining authority and institutional role in California remained intact due to the state-level protections. The peer review article that I've reviewed for this presentation is by McLean and Hurdle Fernandez, published in 2020 in Perspectives on Political, titled The Political Consequences of the Janus Decision for Public Sector Unions. The authors argue that the impact of Janus has varied significantly by state. One key takeaway for me was the union resilience depends heavily on state labor protections and institutional structures. In states with stronger statutory frameworks, such as California and public sectors, unions have remained more stable despite the elimination of mandatory agency fees. This reinforces the importance of state level legal protections. The news story identified is from the Associated Press titled Union Score, a major win in Wisconsin with a court ruling restoring collective bargaining rights. The article explains that a Dane County Circuit Court judge ruled the public worker and teacher unions should have collective bargaining rights restored, reversing key positions of Wisconsin's 2011 Act 10 law. Act 10 had significantly limited most public employees' ability to negotiate wages and working conditions while exempting certain public safety unions. One thing I learned is that Act 10 continues to face constitutional challenges more than a decade later, particularly because of its unequal treatment to different groups of public employees. This connects directly to Chapter 6, which emphasizes the public sector collectively bargains is shaped by the state statute and judicial interpretation. Wisconsin demonstrated how state law can both restrict and potentially restore bargaining authority. In conclusion, SEIU Local 721 represents public employees across Southern California and operates within California's structured yet piecemeal statutory framework. The Meyer-Milius-Brown Act governs local collective bargaining, and the Public Employment Relations Board provides centralized enforcement and administrative consistency. While Janus changed the financial structure of public sector unions nationwide, California's legal protection allow unions like SEIU Local 721 to remain institutionally stable. In contrast, Wisconsin's Act 10 demonstrated how state legislation can significantly restrict collective bargaining authority. This week's material reinforces that public sector collectively bargaining is shaped primarily by state law and administrative enforcement structures. Understanding this framework is essential for public administrators because workforce stability directly impacts public service delivery. And here are references utilized in this presentation. Thank you so much for watching.